Hey everyone, I'm Steve from GamersNexus.net, and today we're reviewing Sword Coast Legends. Sword Coast Legends, which I'm abbreviating to SCL, is a newly released D&D CRPG that has entrenched itself deeply within Wizards of the Coast territory, all the way down to adoption of the 5th edition core rule set of Dungeons & Dragons, the tabletop game. For those who haven't yet dug their way out of insurmountable piles of 3.5 books like I haven't, the rule set may be unfamiliar, but it's still D&D, and the game looks similar in some regard to older D&D CRPG titles like Baldur's Gate, but strays in a few critical ways that we'll discuss in this video. Notably, we're still on the Sword Coast within Forgotten Realms content of Faerun, and Forgotten Realms is a fantasy universe with an extensive population of real-world books and authors, probably the most famous of whom is R.A. Salvatore for his Drizzt Do'Urden series, and he also has contributed to the video games world, so you may know him from there as well. There are iconic cities in the Forgotten Realms universe, like Waterdeep, Baldur's Gate, and Neverwinter, which should probably be familiar to many of you if you're experienced with RPGs. And then there are other known regions like Icewind Dale, which has had its own game series, and The Spine of the World, and Shadow of Am, and things like that. SCL allows up to 4 players cooperatively playing in a party, with an optional 5th player as the DM or Dungeon Master, who plays non-competitively with the players. There are 2 primary modes of play. You're either playing a dungeon crawl or a campaign mode, the latter of which would include the game's built-in story and player-made modules and campaigns alongside developer-made modules, all available for free through downloads in the in-game menus. There's a DM toolkit that allows players to build their own campaigns, complete with dialogue, stories, quests, and mob placement, and we're focusing on that today with the objective of tearing down into the really detailed insides of the DM toolkit. I spent about 8 hours building my own DM style playthrough with a DM required for my group, and my group of players is from the tabletop games that I've played in my 9-year history of 3.5, 4th edition, and Savage Worlds of tabletop RPGs. So we've got quite a bit of history and experience together, and that does mean we were able to have some more fun with Sword Coast Legends than perhaps a random drop-in and play group. A good D&D campaign requires unique locations, colorful NPC, party members and companions, loot, and story, and we're going to go through SCL's ability to enable the DM to add each of these items to their custom campaign within SCL. DM mode allows players to create locations within Faerun and the Underdark, each using a set of prepackaged thematic tiles for the map's generation. And when I say tiles, I mean that it's similar to the tile sets you can buy for miniature gaming, but basically you're not placing tiles. Tiles is just a word that means a theme for the dungeon or area. For example, Bandit Caves or Underdark. So we can create bandit caves, cavernous underdark passages, cities for the dark dwarves or the Duergar, human cities, and similar environments. Upon creating a location, the game rolls the dice to randomly generate rooms and passages within a DM spec, and the DM's specification is limited to just 2 items, size and complexity, ranging from small to large and from simple to complex. This approach allows for rapid deployment of dungeons and leaves some room for the DM to manually position prefab objects, which can include custom text, assignable quests, and discoverability. Basically, if a player searches, will they find the item or the item's action text? Like if you had an engraving on a statue, you might see the statue, but you need to succeed a search or spot equivalent check, which I believe might just be called perception these days, in order to find it. Sadly, the DM has no means to manually carve dungeon pathing or rooms out of solid bedrock, so we're contained within the confines of the game's random number generator as far as the map creation goes. Maps can be managed to a very limited extent by blocking off undesired rooms with impossible to find secret doors, but that's about the extent of our dungeon layout management. So thankfully, through workarounds that we found, if you really don't like how a dungeon is potentially sending players to the boss room before they find the rest of the dungeon, then you can set the boss room's door to be a secret door, set its search DC to impossible, and then just pretend through narrative that they find a key or some means to access that door later, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There's no way to place freeform buildings in cities and no way to add or remove dungeon rooms or pathways, so you are bound to your abilities to utilize the prefab objects like vendor carts, statues, chests, tents, and so forth to get as far as they'll allow you. These can get us pretty far in terms of amping up a dungeon's design, but you're still assuming that your player group actually likes inspecting things, reading flavor text, and stuff like that, because prefab objects are no replacement for actual customization or design or city design or things like that. The restriction feels survivable. We can get by without the ability to customize our dungeons and cities, but it demands more pre-configured locations to adequately sate DM creativity. Otherwise, you're just putting the DM in a box and really strictly limiting creativity. At present, only 8 dungeons and 8 open area tile sets are available, with several dungeons feeling overly similar. They're more of the same, just with a slightly tuned lighting effect and maybe some different moss versus dungeon tile, things like that. I would be more forgiving of the lack of location customization were more locales available, but it just feels like something we won't see until maybe DLC at this point. Overlooking this restriction, we then turn to party members. The backbone of a good campaign, in my experience in tabletop, and in video games for that matter, is a strong cast of NPCs who support the party. Sometimes they're needed to level the difficulty if you want to create a harder encounter but still allow the player party to defeat the encounter. Sometimes they're good for comic relief, they're good for story most of the time, and that's critical to any RPG where you are building some sort of world for players to explore, and this is true of Neverwinter as well. In SCL, there's no DM mode option to add new party members, so you're stuck with the same 5 NPCs from story mode, all with their progression saved from previous games. The best we can do is add a friendly character who's controlled by the DM, so basically a DMPC, as it is called, and that's certainly not ideal. The DMPC won't automatically spawn on level loads, so it won't follow the party from zone to zone as they encounter loading screens, and the only way to get it to spawn there is to pre-place it as the DM or place it live during play. The DMPC also won't automatically follow the party unless it is DM controlled. The DM can possess the NPC, which requires some level of threat, the DM currency for placing objects, and the DMPC also won't gain experience in levels. It has limited dialogue to whatever you set for it through a cumbersome quest menu, and it's really ultimately an extra layer of work for the DM to manage than it's worth when adding a DMPC to the game, because you can't just add it to the player's party and allow them to control it, which would certainly be ideal. This seems like a tremendous oversight to me for a game that offers custom modules and a campaign mode, but it feeds into our forthcoming conclusion, which is that Sword Coast Legends is unnecessarily obsessed with game balance. This is best represented by the restrictions placed on party loot. DMs can't create custom items or plant specific items in chests or as quest rewards. All quest rewards are restricted to, quote, random weapon, random armor, and random trinket, with an immutable option to, quote, reward gold. You don't have an amount you can define. It's just reward gold, and then the game will sort out what it thinks is a balanced amount of gold to reward. Chest loot is random and without control, and further, there is a restriction placed on how many chests are allowed within a level, so that's pretty annoying at times, and this severely challenges creative minds who want to figure out means of narrative and conveyance through traditional pathways like items, whether they're weapons, armor, or just books and things of that nature that you might find. And this challenge makes for difficulty with what would otherwise require interesting and fun items to progress story. The best solution my group of friends found was a lot of shoehorned narration by the DM, and that's fine. It's certainly something we're used to, but at that point you really might as well just play the tabletop game or play with a tabletop simulator like Roll20 or something like that, assuming you are an actual DM or tabletop RPG player. and not just coming for the PC aspect of Sword Coast Legends. Sword Coast Legends is so grossly concerned with keeping the party balanced that it hamstrings itself significantly. It removes its own ability to offer a design toolkit for online DMs who want to really bring their gaming to the next level when it comes to a PC RPG by creating a fun, interesting, and challenging experience for their friends. The game has to appeal to an online audience, and that online audience may want random drop-in and play, of course, so that's a big consideration for the developers to make, and that's where the obsession with balance comes in. Unfortunately, it does limit the game's actual potential to be something truly great and unique, and it's just generally good practice to sacrifice some control as a developer in exchange for more fun as a player anyway, and that's definitely something that reigns true here, where we're not in a player versus player environment, so there's really not as much of a demand for game balance. Even if someone wanted to challenge me on all of this, if one of the developers came to me and said, I disagree that we're being too limiting here, we are being limiting for these reasons, and these reasons make sense. Even in that instance, non-mechanical restrictions are equally heavy. For instance, we can't just add on-click speech to idle city dwellers to provide some background and flavor on the setting. You have to go through a series of somewhat difficult to navigate menus with a lot of clicks in between to create quests and NPCs and things of that nature that are not just the normal ploppable monsters, which you can set to neutral and ideally would be able to allow them to talk to the players if clicked on. For example, if I wanted the townsfolk to talk about the big bad evil guy when clicked on, to build some suspense before the adventure, for instance, the only way to really do that well is through a sort of haphazard workaround that I discovered. You create a custom quest, you name the quest Dialogue or something like that, assign it no rewards, and then assign that quest to all relevant NPCs, and then type their text. This has the contingency that the PCs have to quote-unquote accept the quest, which you can certainly tell them to do. And it's very cumbersome. It immediately flags all NPCs with quest icons just for basic dialogue, which you don't want because you don't want to sidetrack the player characters into thinking that every one of these NPCs is critical to talk to. They're not. It just adds flavor and background. And to further limit this sort of cumbersome option, the dialogue has a restricted length, and it's actually pretty restrictive, so that's another creative cage for the DM. You can't have multiple pages of dialogue. It's just whatever fits in that pre-made box, that's what you can type. And if you want more, you have to either create more quests and get creative with a lengthy series of quest updates and progression for really doing nothing, or you have to create multiple NPCs to talk through the same thing. Action text can be assigned to objects, though, so that's some help. I often opted for the talking statues trope rather than navigating through menus and workarounds just to get an NPC talking. Triggers would have been a phenomenal addition to the SCL editor. There's a period about 14 years ago where I avidly built complex RPG maps in, of all things, Age of Empires 2, which is an RTS, but it had a powerful map editor and it had triggers. It was possible to build these RPGs in AoE 2 because of the trigger, cause, and effect editors, and I was tremendously disappointed to see that SCL doesn't afford DMs the option to add triggered events as a proper RPG, like effect instantiated dialogue or threshold triggers, for two easy examples. Here's an easy and stereotypical example that I could create in AoE 2's editor or several other editors in about 5 minutes. Our heroes step into an empty, foreboding room filled with nothing but prefab spiderwebs and eggs. The door closes behind them once past the threshold trigger, and to ensure no player is locked out, we could say that the lock is openable with a lockpick action, and a 30-second timer begins once that threshold is stepped into and the door is closed. So in this order, our players enter the room, they step onto a red square, which is only red to the DM as a threshold, but not to the players, it's invisible. That threshold has tied to it an effect called 30-second timer, we'll say. 30 seconds starts counting down. During this time, players can interact with in-room objects, foreshadowing text, and if they figure out what's going to happen, they'll ready themselves appropriately, making for some fun strategy for the game. The timer then expires and an encounter spawns, you can guess what that is, it's probably spiders, on the perimeter of the room. In order to do this in the current system, and it is possible, you'd have to manually place the enemies in game. That's fine. It's doable, I guess, but it's clunky and won't have quite the same impact as just spawning all of these monsters at a set time at the same instant. So if you manually spawn them, you're clicking and placing them around the room. It can take several seconds to a minute to really properly configure the encounter, and that removes a lot of the impact and the surprise factor. This also means that a DM is now required to play the encounter properly, so that further mitigates the game's viability as a single-player or unguided co-op adventure platform. This is a big deal. It's very important and cannot be understated. Triggers would allow the game to persist without a DM and still have complex encounters, so that I could go in as a DM, create an adventure for myself and a friend, and then we can travel through it without a DM's direct guidance in order to cause these events. This is a totally non sequitur throw-in, but I was sort of reminded by it by the locking door aspect I talked about. It'd be fantastic to have keys in SCL. There's no way to plant keys right now, and there's no way to associate an object with something like a door or a chest, which is really a weird absence for an RPG. So if you wanted to plant, say, forget the keys, you wanted to plant a book that we can just pretend through narrative has a spell in it that opens a door. So you can't tie that book to the door. You can't plant a key because they don't exist and tie that to the door to open it. It's got to be done by just setting the door to locked with an impossible DC or die check. And then as a DM, you sort of fudge numbers until the players do whatever you want them to do and then open the door. There's also an issue with challenge rating, which, as I understand it, has been largely done away with in more recent D&D editions. Admittedly, I have not played 5th edition, so, but still, that's fine for tabletop, but it's difficult to gauge encounter difficulty without manually testing every encounter when playing an SCL in a self-created module. That probably should be done anyway if you really want it to be a good encounter. But being that testing all encounters is effectively required for a good build, it makes sense to at least give DMs access to a drop-in playtest button. Imagine, if you will, a giant play button in the top right corner of this interface, and I can click it as a DM, and it just drops me wherever I have a player object indicator. It spawns me there, player spawn, and I can test. To me, it'd make more sense to have this droppable player character object and hit play to begin testing at the location dropped than to play through the module in its entirety every time you want to test one encounter. You can save throughout the progression, to be fair to SCL's developers, but that is another cumbersome interface problem, of which we've already mentioned several. This is a serious oversight that places DMs in a hard position of, do I spend hours playtesting every encounter, or do I cut corners, in which case I might have to adjust encounter difficulty on the fly. That is one thing done very well within Sword Coast Legends, though. On-the-fly DM tools, though still lacking, are powerful enough to fudge die rolls and ease up or strengthen encounters. We can place objects and monsters on the fly, or remove them if it's too hard. We can increase or decrease their health depending upon difficulty and challenge, and we've even got the ability to plant last-minute vendors, neutral parties with quests assigned, like collection and kill, and defeat the boss quests, and friendlies who will temporarily aid in fights. The toolkit also makes a provision of some high-quality prefab objects for placement in levels, like statues and furniture and relevant Duergar city ruins, things like that, each with assignable action text and discoverability to reward players for search checks. Creatures and encounters are limited to just 2 creature types per dungeon, for example, demon cultists and underdark dwellers, but the wide range of interesting enemy types and high-quality models within those 2 creature types per dungeon is generally an ample allowance. You've got enough to work with to make for a fun set of mobs. Our means to differentiate and amp up encounters is augmented by a monster creator tool for handcrafted mob generation. So if you wanted to take a floating flaming skeleton and apply it to your only humans set of enemies, you could do that through the monster creator. You can assign custom abilities, change the attributes, do a level offset, all that stuff to make it more interesting in terms of the variety of enemies. My group also liked that DMs can ask players to use an RNG, or random number generator, to roll dice in the chat window. So you can roll d6, d8, d20, things like that. Though it is a bit limited right now, and it's limited in some weird ways. The logic isn't present to add relevant modifiers to die rolls. So if you wanted to do a knowledge check, and I can't remember if knowledge checks are wisdom or intelligence off the top of my head, so work with me here, but if you want to do a knowledge check and say add a wisdom modifier, let's say I have a 14 wisdom, so I get a +2 on that roll. Right now, that has to be sort of ham-fisted, or you do it manually, basically. So if I roll, I type /roll 1d20, and then I tell the DM, okay, I got 14, but I have +2 wisdom, so it's really a 16. I have to do that manually, or the DM has to make up numbers as they go, which is certainly okay, but not ideal. Ideally, with some level of logic in the system, you'd be able to type /roll 1d20 +2, or even better, /roll 1d20 plus whiz, or some identifier that fetches your wisdom modifier and applies it to your d20 roll, something like that. Look, at the end of the day, there's an endless amount of stuff you could ask for in any game, especially a game that has not only a player option, but a DM or creation option. I can sit here and write a huge list of things, and there is a very good chance that 90% of it was already discussed in design meetings by developers. Some of it may have even been in the pipes and was removed. But there's a reason these things don't make it in. It's normally, in the industry, described as either time or money, or both. And that's normal in the world of game development. Some of these decisions, though, were actively made to ensure balance and accommodation of pick-up and play parties, which kills the DM Toolkit's potential and is really not the way that SCL is best utilized, in my opinion. Without custom party members, without triggers, without more fine-tuned map management, or at least more tile sets, we're left with a glorified dungeon crawler using the D&D rule set with an optional add of someone else to drop in more monsters as challenge dictates, which is really not as fun as it could be. That's ultimately what the toolkit comes down to, trying to build challenging encounters for your playgroup, but it forgoes the very important aspect of trying to build interesting and story-driven encounters. You can add text, but it's limited. You can add quests, but you can't add normal dialogue for just clicking on a random neutral party in the dungeon. It's a good way to have fun mechanically through the DM toolkit, but mechanical fun only gets you so far before you burn out. And that puts SCL more in the category of a Diablo-style dungeon crawler, which it's not trying to be. I mean, it is in some ways, but it's got so much more potential to be more than that with the DM toolkit, with the story-driven narratives that it wants to form, and it's just lacking in important aspects. There has to be some way to make new and interesting encounters, and I don't just mean combat, I mean encountering items and objects and modules. Otherwise, players grow accustomed to the reality of the game's minimized toolset. You pick it up, you realize, I have seen everything there is to see, and you move on as a player. And that's sad to me, because Sword Coast Legends has huge potential, but now that the game's released, it's sort of a matter of what's tapped into through DLC and expansion packs, and maybe patches if they feel like it. But the fact of the matter is the framework's out there and it's done, so who knows how many of these things will be taken into consideration going forward. As it stands, the game feels like a $30 crawler that's got maybe about 20 hours of gameplay in it. I do have fun when playing with my old school D&D group when we can't get together to play tabletop, but that fun is still going to be limited. I know that there's a shelf life to my playtime in the game before I get bored of it. That's true with any game, but it's especially true here where I can sense it coming, and that makes it less fun. So all I've really got to say here is I'm disappointed in the DM mode. I wish it were expanded more. Playing as a player with a DM, as a group, it's fun. You'll get places, but if you don't have that already, if you don't have an established group of friends, this game is really going to be a glorified dungeon crawler. And if you do have the group of friends, just expect to be frustrated by the DM toolkit. Expect that you will be able to make it work and have fun, but it takes a lot of extra effort, time, and you have to make sacrifices and then compensate for those sacrifices by filling in your own narrative vocally over whatever voice chat you're using. So that is all for this look at Sword Coast Legends. Please check the website for more information. And if you like this kind of content, hit the Patreon link in the post-roll video. It helps us out a lot. we're trying to do more of these really in-depth discussions on things like game reviews and stuff like that, and Patreon helps us do those. So thank you all for watching. I will see you all next time.